In the year 79, a fast-moving cloud of ash and superheated gas struck the Roman town of Pompeii, and forensic evidence gathered nearly 2,000 years later suggests many of its residents were dead within seconds, not slowly suffocated as popular imagination has long assumed. No single study has fully reconciled the physical evidence with the disaster movie version of that day. Researchers working with plaster casts, human bone, and stacked layers of volcanic debris have reconstructed a death sequence that is faster and in some ways stranger than the textbook account. At the neighboring town of Herculaneum, buried by the same eruption, the evidence points to something even more extreme. Heat intense enough to turn soft tissue to vapor in an instant. Over the next several minutes, we'll walk through 11 documented findings about that day, the technology now reading scrolls that survived it, and the mountain that produced it all, which today sits quiet, monitored, and within sight of several million people. Here's what we actually know about the sequence of events. The only surviving eyewitness account comes from a young Roman named Pliny the Younger, who watched the eruption from across the Bay of Naples and later described it in 2 letters to the historian Tacitus. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, commanded a fleet nearby, sailed toward the disaster to investigate and help with evacuation, and died during the attempt. The specific cause remains debated, with heart failure, a stroke, and asphyxiation from fumes all proposed by different researchers. Pompeii is traditionally said to have been destroyed on the 24th of August. But a piece of charcoal graffiti found on a wall during excavation appears to reference an autumn date, and some volcanologists now argue the eruption likely happened in October instead. That's a strange thing to still be unsettled about a disaster this thoroughly studied, and it's worth asking in the comments why a date this famous still isn't nailed down. That's where the documented trail on dates goes cold, but the physical remains tell their own story. In 1863, the archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli noticed that decomposed victims had left human-shaped voids in the hardened ash layer, and he began pouring liquid plaster into those cavities before excavating around them. The technique produced startlingly detailed casts, folds of clothing, facial expressions, even the collar of a dog killed mid-struggle. For over a century,
Incredible.
museum placards describe the twisted, clenched postures in these casts as final moments of agony. That interpretation is now being quietly revised. The clenched limbs and curled spines seen in many casts are consistent with something called the pugilistic stance, a muscle contraction triggered by extreme heat acting on the body after death, not necessarily a pose struck while still alive and suffering. Forensic researchers studying skeletal remains at Pompeii have found evidence that many victims were killed almost instantly by thermal shock from a pyroclastic surge, a fast-moving current of gas and ash estimated in various studies at somewhere between 200 and 250 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, exposure lasting only a few seconds is enough to be fatal. The bodies were positioned by heat and collapse, researchers argue, not sculpted by a slow death, which changes how the casts should be read entirely. No one disputes that the casts capture real bodies in real positions. It's the identities assigned to those bodies that are now causing an argument. For decades, one famous cast known as the Two Maidens, showing 2 figures embracing, and another known as the muleteer and his companion, were described in guidebooks and documentaries as loving family pairs, often a mother and daughter or 2 sisters, caught together at the end. In 2024, a team of geneticists, including researchers connected to Harvard Medical School, extracted ancient DNA from bone fragments preserved inside several of these casts, and found something the traditional labels did not predict. Some of the so-called embracing pairs were, genetically, unrelated adult males. The study didn't just correct a caption. It suggested that generations of researchers had been projecting assumptions about gender and family onto skeletal evidence the bones themselves never actually supported. If Pompeii's story got revised, Herculaneum's is even more severe. In the 1980s, archaeologists excavating the ancient shoreline at Herculaneum found more than 300 skeletons packed into a row of stone boat chambers, where residents had apparently sheltered while waiting for rescue by sea. Analysis of these skeletons, led by researchers including Pier Paolo Petrone at the University of Naples Federico II, found signs consistent with instantaneous death from extreme heat rather than suffocation by ash. The bones show fracture patterns and discoloration that researchers associate with exposure to surge temperatures that may have exceeded those recorded at Pompeii, given Herculaneum's closer position to the crater. There's one detail researchers keep coming back to, and it's genuinely unusual. In 2020, Petrone and colleagues published findings on a skeleton found in a building known as the Collegium Augustaleum at Herculaneum, describing a glassy black material found inside the victim's skull. Analysis identified this material as vitrified brain tissue, meaning the heat was extreme and sudden enough to convert organic brain matter into a glass-like substance before it had time to burn away entirely. The research team argued this points to temperatures briefly spiking above 500 degrees Celsius, followed by extremely rapid cooling. No comparable case had been documented from this eruption before, and it remains one of the only known instances of vitrified human tissue found anywhere in the archaeological record. If details like this, the kind of forensic trace evidence that quietly rewrites what a 2,000-year-old disaster actually looked like, are the reason you're watching channels like this one, it's worth subscribing, since this is exactly the sort of documented anomaly we build entire episodes around. Moving past the human remains, the ash and pumice layers themselves record the eruption's timeline almost like tree rings. Geologists have identified distinct layers corresponding to different phases. An initial column of pumice and ash that fell for hours, followed by a series of pyroclastic surges that arrived in pulses, each one faster and hotter than simple ashfall. Pompeii was mostly affected by the early pumice fall, which gave many residents time to flee, while the later surges are what killed those who stayed. Herculaneum, closer to the crater, was struck by the destructive surges almost from the start, with little warning and no early phase to escape during. Officially, everything at Herculaneum and Pompeii was destroyed by the eruption. The problem is that one building preserved something almost nowhere else in the ancient world survives intact: written text. In the 1750s, workers digging a well near Herculaneum struck the remains of an enormous private residence now known as the Villa of the Papyri, containing a library of roughly 1,800 scrolls. The extreme heat of the eruption had carbonized the papyrus, turning each scroll into a fragile black cylinder that looked, to early excavators, like burnt logs of firewood. Attempts to physically unroll them destroyed many outright, and the scrolls that survived intact were considered too fragile to open for nearly 250 years. That should have been the end of the story. A library preserved, but permanently unreadable. It wasn't. In 2023, a project called the Vesuvius Challenge, backed by the entrepreneurs Nat Friedman and Daniel Gross, and built on years of prior research by the computer scientist Brent Seals at the University of Kentucky, used high-resolution X-ray computed tomography to scan the scrolls without ever unrolling them. Machine learning models were then trained to detect subtle differences in the scan data between carbonized papyrus and the ink resting on its surface, an approach the team called virtual unwrapping. The method let researchers digitally flatten a scroll's interior layers and search for legible characters, all without touching the fragile object itself. The first confirmed word recovered this way was the Greek term for purple, found by a team member working from the published scan data, and it triggered a wave of further discoveries as more competitors joined the effort. Later passages, drawn from a scroll believed to contain philosophical writing associated with the Epicurean philosopher Philodemus, discussed subjects including pleasure and, in one section, the availability of certain foods in small quantities. Only a fraction of the roughly 1,800 scrolls from the villa have been scanned and processed so far, and researchers have not determined whether other rooms of the villa, still unexcavated beneath volcanic rock, might contain a second library of Latin texts to match the Greek one already found. Whether that second collection even exists is a question no one has been able to answer. This is where most explanations of Pompeii quietly stop, with the past. But the volcano responsible for all of it never went anywhere. Mount Vesuvius has erupted repeatedly since the year 79, with its most recent eruption recorded in 1944, and it has remained continuously monitored since 1841 by what is now the Osservatorio Vesuviano, the oldest volcano observatory in the world. currently operated as part of Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology. Instruments track seismic activity, ground deformation, and gas emissions around the crater on an ongoing basis, feeding into an official evacuation plan for the surrounding region. Here's the detail that doesn't fit the comfortable idea of Pompeii as ancient history. The area classified as the volcano's highest risk red zone is now home to several 100,000 people, and the wider metropolitan area of Naples surrounding the mountain holds an estimated 3 million residents, according to figures cited by Italian civil protection authorities. Volcanologists studying Vesuvius's eruption history have noted that the mountain has gone through cycles of long dormancy followed by major eruptions before, including the roughly 3-century quiet period that preceded the disaster in 79. Some researchers have pointed out that the current calm, now stretching past 8 decades since 1944, falls well within the range of past dormant intervals, though there is no scientific consensus on when or how the next major eruption might unfold. That is the paradox sitting underneath every plaster cast in the Pompeii Archaeological Park. A mountain that has already demonstrated exactly what it's capable of, still standing, still watched, directly above one of the most densely populated volcanic regions on Earth. So return for a moment to that fast-moving cloud that struck Pompeii within seconds, the one described at the very start of this video. What's actually confirmed is significant. Eyewitness letters from Pliny the Younger, plaster casts showing heat-driven muscle contraction rather than slow suffocation, skeletal and tissue evidence from Herculaneum pointing to death by thermal shock, and now, computed tomography and machine learning successfully reading carbonized scrolls once considered permanently lost. What remains genuinely unresolved is narrower but real. The exact temperature curve experienced by individual victims, the true scale and contents of the library still buried and unscanned at the Villa of the Papyri, and whether a second, Latin collection is sitting in an unexcavated wing of that same villa. Pompeii is often treated as a closed case, a disaster fully explained and safely filed under ancient history. The forensic and archaeological record suggests otherwise. New evidence is still surfacing from ash that fell nearly 2,000 years ago on a mountain that has never stopped being capable of doing it again. Somewhere in that unopened villa, researchers already suspect there may be more scrolls than anyone has confirmed, and no one currently knows what's written on them. The people once described simply as sisters, or as a mother and her son, have already taught us that the assumptions built on top of evidence can be wrong even when the evidence itself is sitting in a museum case, fully preserved for over a century. Vesuvius is still there, still measured daily by instruments a short drive from Pompeii's gates, and the next chapter of this particular story has not been written yet, by anyone.